Hello, this is Diane Dalton. I'm going to discuss the Chapter 5 in our textbook on looping. Looping is all about repeating a block of code numerous times so that you can go through, say, a list of people or a list of classes or a list of purchases, whatever it might be. Looping is about repeating the same executable code many times. There are three main ways to create a loop in the C# programming language. Number one is the while loop. Number two is the for loop, and the third one is called the do loop, or often called a do while loop. And we'll look at all three ways of those to create a loop in the C# programming language. First of all, let's look at what a loop is. As you're executing code, and this is just a segment of a flowchart, you'd be executing statements and come to here, and this is where you make a decision point. Shall I do this again? And if you say yes, then you're going to go execute another group of code called the loop body. That's the code that you want to repeat multiple times. After that, you go back to test again. Shall I repeat this again? Okay, so that's a test condition. If it's true, you keep executing this. At some point, this will become false, and you will exit out of that loop and continue on with the next statement in the sequence. Right, so when you're using a loop, there are some times that you can get into something called an infinite loop. That's a loop that may never end. And you need to avoid that. There needs to always be some way that the loop control variable, and that's the variable that you're testing at the beginning of your loop, there's got to be some way for that variable to change within the loop so that at some point the test will become false and you will end the loop. So here's a little example of some code written in a flowchart. Here we initialize the number equal 1. We set some limit to equal 5. And we're setting a test. So we're going to say, is our number less than the limit? Well, initially 1 is less than 5, so that's true. So we'll go do our execution, our code block, right? And the first thing it says is this is just writing out a simple hello message. And then what we're doing here is incrementing that number. We're taking number 1, adding 1 to it, and storing it back into number. All right, so now we go up here, we go back and repeat our test. That's the loop. We loop back to that same spot. So now we're going to test. Now our number is equal to 2. Is that less than the limit? Yes, it's still less than 5. We'll go write hello again. Increment this. Now our number's 3. Go back to the loop place. We'll test again. All right, so you see how that's going to go several times. Eventually the number is going to get to 5. We'll say, is 5 less than 5? No, it's equal. It's not less than. Now our test case is false, and we will exit the loop. We will no longer execute this loop of code. So here's how that looks actually in C#. This is the syntax for a while loop. Right, these are just declarations, again, and this number is being initialized to 1. This is a constant. That just means that the word limit, or the variable limit, is really not a variable. It's not going to change. It's set to 5. All right, so here's the syntax for our while loop. It's from the while, and then the curly braces here, the left one and the right one, define the loop body. So when this test case is true, we will execute the code that's in between these. Now the code in here needs to have something that's going to change our loop control variable. In this case, it's number. You see, number is the one that's being tested. So it is being changed, which means we will eventually reach the condition where this test is false and we will drop out of the loop. There are sometimes you can make mistakes in writing a loop. You can have an empty body. Well, how do you do that? Well, if you put a semicolon immediately after your while statement, you've just created an empty body. That's a mistake you might make. Now, within the loop, within a good while loop, you need to make sure that you're changing your control variable. You're either incrementing it or decrementing it. Okay? You need to have some way that control variable is changing as you're going through the loop. Now, there are some things called a definite loop. That means you know exactly how many times it's going to go through the loop. That previous example from 1 to 5 is an example. It's going to happen 4 times when the loop counter is 1, 2, 3, and 4. When the loop counter gets to 5, it's no longer less than 5, so it will drop out. Now, an indefinite loop is something where you don't know exactly how many times it's going to happen. And that's usually because the loop control variable is read as a user input, where the user might have the option of typing yes or no or continue or quit, and you don't know exactly when that user is going to choose to exit out of the loop. So that's an indefinite loop because it's dependent on user input. Here's an example of one with the user input that's modifying the loop control variable. All right, so here we've got some declarations. We're going to send out a message. Do you want to see your balance? Yes or no? And notice this is a capital Y or a capital N. Okay, we're going to read the input string. We're going to convert it to the response. So this response is a single character. So it's going to read either a Y or an N. Well, we're going to test. While the response is equal to a capital Y, we're going to do what's between these curly brackets. That's our loop body. Okay, and what we're going to do now is we're going to write out another message. We're going to go ahead and increment our bank balance, adding some interest rate. We're accumulating interest here. We're going to write out another message. Do you want to go see this again? Do you want to see your next year's balance? We're going to read that input and we're going to convert it to a character. All right, so here's the place, this response. We're modifying our loop control variable. We're reading it from the user. Now we don't know exactly when the user is going to choose to change from a yes to a no, but we'll go back up because we're executing this while loop, which means when we get to this one, we're going to go back to this while and do this test again. So we'll do the response. Is the response equal to yes? Well, it's not predictable because it all depends on what the user chooses to do. That's why it's an indefinite loop. Now, the second type of loop is called a for loop. And that's for a definite loop where you know exactly what your limits are going to be. They're going to go from one starting position, but you know exactly how many times you need to go through the loop. Right? There's 3 sections of the for loop that you're going to do. You're going to initialize your control variable, you're going to test it, and you're going to update it. 2 examples of doing a loop that's very similar, one with the while and one using the for. Okay, so let me show you the while. We've looked at that already. We declare an integer x, we declare a constant limit of 10, we set our x equal to 1, we do a while x less than or equal to our limit, we're writing something out, and then we're going to increment our x. We'll go back, this is the loop, we're going to keep repeating until x is no longer less than or equal to the limit. Alright, so it's going to go through that 10 times. Now we can do a loop that will do all of the same stuff using a for loop. This is a different syntax. It will accomplish the exact same thing as this group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines did. We can do it here in 2 lines. And this syntax is a little shorthand. You start with a for, and there's 2 parentheses. The first part, or before the first semicolon, got x equals 1. That's the initialization. The next part is your limit. What's your test? What are you testing for to end the loop? Another semicolon, and then what are you going to do to your loop control variable to change it? You can increment it, you can decrement it, whatever you need to do. You might add 2 to it if you're going through even numbers. Okay? But something has to change on your loop control variable. Right? So that's the syntax. Your initialization, your test, and your change. Okay? And then this is just the loop body. In this case, because it's only a single line, we don't have to have these curly brackets. I tend to like to see the curly brackets. It helps you see that you're working with a loop. But in this case, this still is legitimate syntax to have just the for statement and 1 line following it. The while and the for loop are very similar in that they both test the test condition before they execute the loop. That's a significant difference, and they're very similar, but the for loop is for definite loops and it's a shorthand of a while loop. There's another syntax, and that's called the do loop. The difference with the do loop is it will guarantee that you will perform your loop at least 1 time because it executes the loop and then it does the test. So that's the significant difference between a do loop and a while loop. A while loop tests first and then executes the loop, where a do loop will execute the loop once and then test to see if it should continue. So let's look at the syntax. In this case, you're going to have a loop body, and then you're going to test your variable, and if it's true, you'll go back and you'll repeat the loop. Okay, so you can see this test is at the end. It's after you've executed the loop body once. So here's an example. This is part of the loop body. Several statements here, similar to that bank balance example before, where you come into this from some other part of code perhaps. You'll start your do loop. You'll write something, increment your bank balance, you'll write another question, you'll get the response, and then you'll test. And if it's true, in this case the test is the response equal to y? If it's true, you go yes, and you go back to the beginning of your loop. That makes sure that you're going to run through this set of code at least once before you get to this test. Now here's the code. That's pretty small to see, so let's go to the next page where I've expanded this. Here's our declarations, and we have two numbers being initialized. Here's the syntax for the do loop. We start with the do, we have the loop, that's the loop body, followed by the while, and here's the test. So it's the do while. So this is what we're going to do. This block of code called the loop body while this is true. Right, so it's the same code as the one where we had it as a while loop. We're also reading in a character string. We're testing to see if it's a yes. But we're doing all of this at least once before we do our test. Okay. One other important thing I want to point out here, where this is doing a test for yes or no. This is looking for a capital Y. That means if you were to type in a lowercase y, it would not be a true case. Okay, it would drop out of this loop. So that's very specific here. Another thing to notice here is this is a single quote or an apostrophe surrounding a single character. That means it's a single character and not a string of one length. Okay, so those are two important little details here. If you wanted this to respond and continue the loop, if you answered with a capital Y or a lowercase y, you could put an or, the two vertical bars, or response equal lowercase y. Here's how it would look if your test is true for either a capital Y or a lowercase y. So response equals yes, response equals y capital Y, or response equals y for a lowercase y. Now an important thing to note here, the instructions say to type capital Y or a capital N. In reality, any character you type that's not a capital Y or a lowercase y in this case would cause you to drop out of this loop.